Good afternoon, and welcome to another Waukegan History Museum Lunch and Learn. My name is Ty Rohr. I am the manager of cultural arts for the Waukegan Park District. I also work on behalf of the Waukegan Historical Society. Today's topic, the Civil War, the war efforts in Waukegan. So today I will discuss the Civil War and some of the local war efforts that took place and some of the people who participated. Now, even though the war officially started with the Confederate States firing on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861 at 4:30 in the morning, the war really started many years before when the country was just forming. But the country finally reached its boiling point on the issue of slavery. Leading up to the war, there were many people in Lake County who were opposed to the institution of slavery found in the South. Many were part of the secret network of escape routes that were used to help runaway slaves known as the Underground Railroad. There are a few suspected Underground Railroad sites in Lake County. Many slaves were able to make their way into Lake County after traveling north along the Mississippi River from the slave states in the South. Once slaves made it to Lake County, many made their way into Waukegan, where they would continue their journey north to Wisconsin and then Canada on a ship sailing Lake Michigan. Now the whole Underground Railroad story, well, maybe we'll do that one another time though. Many in Lake County supported the Republican Party at that time, and Abraham Lincoln was even invited to Waukegan to give a speech for the people of the county before he was elected president. Actually, even before he was officially running for president. And when Lincoln was elected, he carried more than 60% in Illinois, with Lake County highly in his favor over his longtime foe, U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas actually also spoke in Waukegan, 2 times in fact. The election of Lincoln brought a quick response from the South. Within 3 months, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had seceded from the Union. They adopted a provisional constitution for the Confederate States of America and elected a provisional president, Jefferson Davis. One of the most interesting aspects of this time was that Lincoln still had 4 months left, and there were still 4 months until he would be inaugurated. James Buchanan was the president at the time. And I see a bunch of folks just joining in. Welcome to this History Lunch and Learn in the Civil War. When Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861, he took a firm stance against the South and hoped that the South would eventually rejoin the Union voluntarily. This would not happen, as the South fired the first shots on Fort Sumter. People in Waukegan and Lake County first heard of the news that Fort Sumter had fallen through the telegraph on April 15th, 3 days after the start of the bombardment. The complete story of the start of the Civil War was first read in Waukegan on April 20th, 8 days after the first shots were fired. The newspaper reflects the sentiments of the time, which was that the falling of Sumter was looked at as a rallying cry for the North to take action against the South to restore the Union. So here we see the Waukegan Weekly Gazette, Saturday, April 20th, 1861, with James Corey, the editor. Civil War commenced. The news of the fall of Sumter brought an immediate response from Waukegan Mayor David Ballantyne. Mayor Ballantyne called a meeting at the Lake County Courthouse. Prominent individuals in the city made patriotic speeches as to what could be done to help restore the Union, and several persons enrolled their names as volunteers to fight for the Union cause during that meeting. A second meeting was called on April 16th, and it was determined that funds would be raised locally to help defray the expenses of organizing companies of troops. After a few hours, $1,000 had been raised. By April 22nd, Lake County had assembled enough soldiers that they were sent to Chicago to start their training. They were the first group of volunteers outside of Chicago to arrive in that city. The group was sent on to Springfield and were stationed at Camp Yates. The company was known as Company H, Waukegan Zouaves, and they numbered 84 members. So here you can see the list of the first 84 of Company H. Of the 84, 53 came from Waukegan. Then you can see there at the bottom where the others were coming from within the county. Now, why Company H chose the title of Zouaves, we do not know. Zouave was a title given to certain French army regiments that served in French Africa starting in 1831. The name Zouave and uniform was adopted by some volunteer regiments in the Civil War. And the uniform was very unique and recognizable as it included a short, open-fronted jacket, baggy trousers, sashes, and oriental headgear. And the uniform was usually very colorful. Company H experienced difficulties early on. Many of the boys became seriously ill within a short time after arriving in Springfield. The company was ultimately disbanded, and the men were sent home because there was a surplus of volunteers and not all could be used. Nearly all of the men from Company H eventually entered the service later on and would fight with other groups in the war. But the first Lake County man to die in the Civil War came from Company H. His name was Oscar Douglas. He died after returning home from disease that he contracted while at camp in Springfield. Many men from Lake County, approximately 17,000 men, would eventually participate in the war. The most common regiments for the Lake County men to serve in were the 96th Illinois U.S. Infantry, the 17th Illinois U.S. Cavalry, and the 39th Illinois U.S. Infantry. Even though Waukegan and Lake County was far from the fields of battle in the South, life was still difficult. Many people had loved ones or knew of someone that was involved in the war effort. Early in the war, many families even traveled and followed their loved ones to camp, and sometimes even on campaign. However, as the war went on, this became increasingly more difficult. Back home, families had to wait patiently for letters to come from the soldiers. Letters were the only means of communication between families and soldiers. Newspapers provided updates on the various campaigns and battles. Occasionally, casualties were listed in the papers. Sometimes, what they listed were not accurate. Many people in Waukegan took up the cause to help support the soldiers at war. For instance, the Ladies Soldiers Aid Society planned trips to visit wounded troops who were recovering in Chicago. Fundraisers were held to raise money for medical supplies, food, ammunition, clothes, and shelter for the soldiers. With so many of the men from Waukegan and Lake County serving in the war, women had the great responsibility of maintaining homes, farms, and businesses. In their free time, many women chose to make uniforms and bandages and to send care packages to their loved ones and other soldiers. A major concern in Waukegan, as it was in other cities around the country, was the care of returning soldiers wounded during the war. In Waukegan, during the time of the Civil War, there were fewer than 10 doctors in the city, and Waukegan did not yet have a hospital, so many of the returning soldiers had to be taken care of in their own homes or in makeshift facilities. Women who previous to the war had not been allowed to be nurses now were the primary caregivers for many soldiers. However, some parts of life remained the same during the war. Special events, such as the circus coming to town, were welcome diversions from the war and from worrying about loved ones. Now, in Waukegan, 470 men served in the war. Now, at that time, Waukegan's population was 3,500. So, and that was 3,500 in 1860. So about 15% of Waukegan enlisted as a soldier. I'm not going to talk about all 470 today. And actually, of that 470, we expect at a certain point to know of a few more that participated. Those are really those that served in the infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The naval records still really haven't been compiled. When we did our research a few years ago for this, we weren't able to find a lot of names in that, but we expect Waukegan to have some representation in the Navy, especially with us being right there on Lake Michigan. And many of our citizens at that time working on the lake or being familiar with that type of work. The first soldier I will talk about, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac L. Clark. Clark was a prominent man in Waukegan prior to the war. He was a lawyer and was also a principal at the Waukegan Academy. And the Waukegan Academy, which had been started by abolitionists, opened in 1846, originally in the basement of the courthouse, and then eventually on Genesee Street. For you Waukeganites out there, I'm sure you are familiar with the Academy Theater. The Academy School stood on that site prior to the theater, and that Academy name was carried over to the theater, and today that location is known as Academy Square. When the war broke out, Isaac Clark used his stature in the city and in the county to help recruit and try to organize a company of soldiers for the 96th Illinois Infantry. He was not able to recruit enough from just Lake County, but was able to partner up with Joe Daviess County. They too had not been able to assemble enough for a full company, but the two combined worked out well. With the company, they elected Isaac Clark to be the lieutenant colonel for them. And it was during the company's first real battle, the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia, as Lieutenant Colonel Clark was leading his men in battle, he was mortally wounded. The news comes back to Waukegan. Many in the city, of course, are shocked and saddened by the loss of Clark. Many at this point still, even though the war has been going on for a little bit of time here when Chickamauga happens, many still believe that the higher ranking officers were safe in the war and were shocked that Clark would be killed on the battlefield. They're starting to realize that folks like a lieutenant colonel, they are right down there in the thick of that fighting. So Clark was struck down on September 20th, 1863, and his family was able to have his body returned back to Waukegan, and he is buried in Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. Many of those soldiers lost in the battlefields, they are buried in national cemeteries there, but Clark was brought back home. Next, we have Michael Dlin. When we think of the Civil War, we think, of course, of Americans fighting and killing other Americans. But many of these folks had not been born in America. Some had been really recent immigrants. Some stories of those as they arrive, they are recruited to fight in the war. Michael Devlin, he was an immigrant from Ireland, and he moves to Waukegan in the 1850s. He enlisted as a volunteer at the creation of the 96th Regiment under the guidance of Isaac Clarke, and he was 23 years old at the time. He served 3 years, was mustered out on June 10, 1864. During his service, he was promoted corporal, sergeant, and commissioned second lieutenant. Dlin participated in all engagements until Kennesaw Mountain, when he and Albert Barney, also of Waukegan, were captured while relieving the picket line. Dlin was imprisoned at Andersonville, and later at the prison at Florence. He finally escaped from the prison at Florence in February 1865, and he continued in service. That's some bad information there. He was able to escape from the prison at Florence as the Union was getting closer. So he was a survivor of both Andersonville and Florence, and then his time in the service was done. But his story with this isn't over. I will bring Dlin's name up here in just a bit. Dlin was a farmer in the area. Our most prominent Civil War soldiers come from the Howe family. The Howe family brought recognition to Waukegan in an unusual way. At the start of the Civil War in 1861, Father William and his sons Orion and Lyston all listed in the Army as musicians. While William was a veteran of the Mexican War, the boys were getting their first taste of military life at a very tender age. The youngest boy, Lyston Howe, he was born in Ohio on August 27, 1850. When he entered the Army as a drummer boy, he was only 10 years, 10 months, and 9 days old. This made him the youngest soldier in the Union Army, and he was discharged a few months later because of measles, but he re-enlisted and kept participating in the war. Now, Lyston, being the youngest in the Union Army, has that unique distinction. The Howes had moved to Waukegan after Orion and Lyston's mother had passed away, and that is where they did volunteer from. I do have a little anecdotal story here, the bravery of Lyston. It says, at one point during his last campaign, Lyston lost his horse. He was able to find a small pony continue with his regiment. A Confederate lieutenant saw the young boy on the pony and started to give chase. Lyston started to lead the rebel soldier toward the Union lines. Lyston suddenly drew his pony to a halt and spun around. This maneuver surprised the rebel soldier and continued on past the boy without being able to stop. The Confederate officer rode his horse right into the Union lines and was forced to surrender. Lyston traded his pony for the rebel soldier's horse and continued on. But the most famous of the boys was Orion. Orion Perseus Howe was born also in Ohio. This was on December 29, 1848. And his great distinction happens while he and his regiment are at Vicksburg. During the siege of Vicksburg, Orion, like the other musicians, was charged with assisting the wounded at the rear of the line. The musicians were considered to be non-combatants and would wear a white handkerchief on their left arm to let the enemy know that they were not to be shot at. During his duties, his unit was running short on ammunition. Orion was now required to bring powder and shot to the soldiers fighting on the front. Orion grabbed cartridge boxes from dead and wounded soldiers laying on the battlefield. Orion repeated this measure 3 times to gather as much ammunition as he could. Well, eventually, as the story goes, Colonel Oscar Malmberg gathers the musicians around. He needs to get a message across the battlefield to General Sherman. His boys were running low of supplies and ammunition. And it's said that 3 boys volunteered to cross the battlefield with the message from Oscar Malmberg, from the colonel. Now, one of these boys needed to make it across. If not, well, the hopes were growing dim for the soldiers in that regiment. So as Orion crosses the battlefield with the other boys, well, I have an account from one of the soldiers. He says, "We could see him nearly the whole way as he ran through what seemed like a hailstorm of canister and musket balls. So thickly did these fall about him, each throwing up its little puff of dust where it struck the dry hillside. Suddenly he dropped and heart sank, thinking his brief career ended, but he only tripped over some articles. Often he stumbled, sometimes falling prostrate, but was quickly up again and finally disappearing from us, limping over the summit." Now, actually, Orion had not tripped, and some of the soldiers said that he was a clumsy boy, but in this case, he had actually been struck in the leg by a musket ball. Orion made his way across the battlefield, still injured. At the edge of the battlefield, he apparently comes across some other officers. They see that he is wounded, and they order him to go to the makeshift hospital, but he refuses. He has his order that he has to get to General Sherman. Now, in some accounts, it states that the other 2 boys that were with Orion were killed on the battlefield. Some accounts have just Orion going across the battlefield by himself. Regardless, he was wounded, and he has to find Sherman to be able to save the other soldiers in his regiment. Somehow, some way, he makes it to General Sherman's camp. General Sherman is there, sitting upon his war horse, and he sees the young Waukegan boy limp up to him. Here I'll read to you a letter that Sherman wrote a few months later after Vicksburg. Sherman said, "When the assault on Vicksburg was at its height on the 19th of May, and I was in front near the road which formed my line of attack, this young lad came up to me wounded and bleeding with the good, healthy boy's cry, 'General Sherman, send some cartridges to Colonel Malmberg. The men are all out.' Sherman then promised Orion that supplies would be sent and ordered him to the hospital. But Sherman recalled that as the boy was walking away, he turned around and shouted, 'Caliber 54, sir.'" And Sherman continues in the letter, says, "I have never seen the boy since, but I shall not forget that one so young, carrying a musket ball through his leg, should have found his way to me and delivered his message, not forgetting the very important part, even the caliber of the musket." Now, after relaying the message to Sherman, Orion made his way to the hospital, where luckily they were able to save his leg. Orion was then given 3 months off to recover. Then he is back again with his regiment, Company C of the 55th Illinois Infantry. And he then finds himself at the Battle of Dallas, Georgia. He is wounded again. This is on May 27th, 1864, wounded in the chest. That was a long, dramatic pause, but don't worry. He survived that injury as well. He was a tough kid. He was not able to continue in the war, though, after that second injury, and he was honorably discharged on October 5th, 1864. Now, with Orion Howe, we've been studying him some more, trying to learn more of his story. Eventually, he becomes a dentist. Probably not the way that you thought that story was going to end. But doing some research on him, Orion Howe and his story is featured at the Kenosha Civil War Museum. He is mentioned at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library as well, so they've done research on him. It looks like he spends 14 years after the war drifting the plains of Texas, the Dakotas, Missouri, and he's living the life as a cowboy. One account that we found in some research at the Lincoln Presidential Library was that Orion Howe was friends with Wild Bill Hickok. And this note said that when Hickok was killed in Deadwood, South Dakota on August 2nd, 1876, that Orion was there with him at the time, and that Orion helped to track down Hickok's killer, Jack McCall. This is a story that we are still researching and hoping to find more evidence of. What a great story that would be, and a great connection for us to find. So if we ever do find some more on there, we'll let you know, of course. But that's Orion Howe, our most famous soldier from Waukegan that participated in the war, enlisting at the age of 12. Wounded at Vicksburg at the age of 14, continuing his duty while after being hurt, and for his actions. That day at Vicksburg, he was later given the Medal of Honor. And if he is not the youngest person to receive this award, he is right there. And I'll finish with George Washington Bell. Now, Bell was not living in Waukegan at the time, but I'll still share his story because it's just a fun one. Bell actually was born on a plantation in Nashville, Tennessee, born into slavery. When the war broke out, his master had him carrying food and supplies to a nearby Confederate camp. And during one of these trips, he was captured by Union soldiers. And Bell was known in Waukegan as being a great storyteller. So one of the stories he told was the time when he was captured by the Union. He said that there, as he's carrying supplies for the Confederacy, something that he did not want to support but didn't have a choice, he is captured by the Union soldiers, and there at gunpoint, they give him the choice of volunteering for the Union cause, or they would shoot him dead right there. Bell said that this was an easy decision to make. He didn't need to have the guns pointed at him because he always wanted to support the Union cause. So Bell is assigned to the 40th Tennessee Cavalry, and first he starts out as a cook. Now, in the stories he shared was that his cooking was fantastic, and that President Lincoln enjoyed his food, and when he was visiting the battlefield, well, he would make sure to stop by the 40th Tennessee Cavalry because he liked what Bell was cooking. Probably the best story that he shared was, well, he had caught word that some of the slaves from the plantation that he was originally from, well, they were being loaded up on trains to be sent farther south, as the slave masters were worrying of losing their slaves and their property as the Union was getting closer. Well, Bell knew some of these folks and knew that if they made it on this train, he might never see them ever again. So he told a few other soldiers that he was going to stop that train. He grabbed a pistol and rifle, mounted a horse, charged towards the train going through a Confederate picket line. He said he boarded the engine and at gunpoint told the engineer, the conductor, to stop the train. But the conductor refused, and Bell shot him dead. Other Confederate soldiers heard the gunshot. They rushed towards the train, but Bell was able to keep them from boarding it. Luckily, some of the other soldiers in Bell's regiment had followed behind, and they, along with Bell, were able to stop that train and liberate those slaves. And it turned out that George Washington Bell really had one slave in particular that he wanted to save. Her name was Emily Babb. Not long after this, George Washington Bell and Emily Babb, they would get married, and they would move to Waukegan together and start their families here and live in Waukegan for the rest of their life. And both George and Emily are buried next to each other in Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. Not sure what happened there. Now, both the Union and the Confederacy had expected a quick victory. It didn't happen that way. But finally, rumors start to trickle in on Monday, April 10th, that Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered on April 9th. With this news, the war was essentially over. Now it was time to start rejoicing. The Union was victorious. The Civil War was coming to an end. So upon hearing this news, well, it was decided that the old cannon on the grounds of the courthouse would be fired to symbolize the victory. And Michael Devlin had recently returned, remember, surviving both Andersonville and Florence prison camps. And Devlin had said that, well, he made it through the Civil War without a single scratch, and even making it through those camps. So Devlin, well, he was given the honor of firing the old cannon. Well, the cannon misfired, and it explodes in Devlin's face. He falls backwards, he's unconscious. People think that it has killed him. Luckily, he regains his consciousness. He had lost a little bit of hearing, but he was okay. But amazingly, Michael Devlin's only injury in the Civil War happens when he is trying to help Waukegan celebrate the end of the war by firing the old cannon on the grounds of the courthouse. Well, it's the Saturday Waukegan Weekly Gazette, and that's when it came out, on Saturdays. And here, folks in Waukegan were able to read about Lee's surrender. Glorious news. End of the war. Again, this is Saturday, April 15th, 1865. So as people are sitting there reading their paper, I'm sure very joyous occasion. The celebrations had already started. Well, other news is starting to trickle in through the telegraph. President Lincoln has been shot. Lincoln is assassinated. The local festivities to celebrate the end of the war, well, they are set aside with the somber news of Lincoln's death. We do have a few citizens who went down to Chicago to be a part of or to witness the Lincoln funeral. John Charles Haynes, who eventually, or at this point, owned what is today known as the Waukegan History Museum in Bowen Park. Well, he was a former mayor in 1858 and 1859. Haynes was given the distinction of welcoming the Lincoln funeral train to the state of Illinois. And we did have at least one soldier participate down with the funeral procession in Springfield. But again, with Waukegan, we had 470 serve, at least that we know of today. Here you see the different regiments that we have found Waukegan boys listed in. Now, it's difficult to research some of them. Some of them, as they volunteer, they come to Waukegan, maybe from other parts of the county, but they put Waukegan as their residence. It might have been, it might not have been, but we're pretty good with the 470. So we go through the list here. If you ever are interested in seeing this list or wondering if you have an ancestor from Waukegan that fought in the war, please feel free to reach out to us. And of the 470 from Waukegan, 39 died in the war. Isaac Clark dies on the battlefield. A few others die on the battlefield as well, but the majority do die of different diseases. Following the war, well, for instance, when the 96th come home, the folks in Waukegan and really in the county were grateful for the contributions and sacrifices of the soldiers. And when the 96th Regiment arrived in Chicago on June 14, 1865, they had a parade and special speeches commemorating the efforts of that regiment. And the final disbandment occurred on Wednesday, June 28th. The members of the Lake County companies boarded a special train for arrival in Waukegan that afternoon. Local citizens had planned a gala reception for them, but were unsure of the precise time of return. A telegram was sent from Chicago that morning giving travel details, thus setting off final preparations. When the train reached the Waukegan depot at 3:30 p.m., it was greeted by a reception committee, a band, and a crowd of citizens. Thousands more were lined up along the bluff. Amid a booming cannon and ringing bells, the men got off the train to hear the locals cheering them. A procession began, leading them to the top of the bluff, where young women ringed the men and showered them with flowers. The parade continued on Washington to Utica Streets, north of Clayton Street, down to Genesee Street, and back to Washington. A platform was erected in front of Dickinson Hall, and welcoming speeches were given. Following the speeches, everyone entered the hall to celebrate with an enormous feast. After the repast, the men were given cigars and heard additional speeches citing their accomplishments. Much cheering rolled over the veterans as they departed for their homes. On Thursday, the Joe Davies companies left Chicago, and receptions similar to Waukegan's were given to honor them in the cities of Warren and Galena. Here in this picture, you're seeing the veterans of the Civil War, the Lake County chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic. And this picture is taken on Genesee Street in front of the Grand Army of the Republic Hall. Today, those buildings aren't there anymore, or most of them. Parking lot space, and a few of them are still there, though. So that's the northwest corner of Washington and Genesee. And the Grand Army of the Republic was an organization for the soldiers and sailors who had served in the Civil War. And the Waukegan Post number 374 was formed on January 3rd, 1884. And they met every 2 weeks, except during June, July, and August, when they met only once. Veterans of the Civil War from throughout Lake County were members. The post met at different locations for every meeting, including Antioch, Wakanda, Grays Lake, Fox Lake, and Waukegan. In 1937, when there were so few members left, the organization disbanded and turned the records over to the American Legion, Homer Derringer Post 281. They also gave them their Post 374 flag. This flag was displayed at the Legion Hall until the Legion gave these documents and artifacts to the Waukegan Historical Society. Today, the Grand Army of the Republic Post 374 flag is prominently displayed at the Waukegan History Museum. And the idea of erecting a monument to honor veterans arose shortly after the end of the Civil War. Planning meetings were held as early as 1865. In 1867, the state legislature authorized an appropriation by the Lake County Board of Supervisors to pay for it. That action prompted construction meetings. The project was moving ahead, but then stalled for unknown reasons. While there may have been continued public interest, nothing positive occurred for about 20 years. A February 1889 fair raised around $500 towards construction. But once again, nothing happened. Finally, in mid-1897, the Soldiers Monument Society decided to move the project forward. It was decided to build on the courthouse square, and designs were sought. The contract was given to Fred Bairstow for $6,000. At last, all work was completed and the monument's dedication was held on August 29, 1899. 1,200 soldiers from Fort Sheridan arrived on special trains. They were joined by an artillery battery recently returned from Cuba. Grand Army of the Republic posts, along with other veterans and local fraternal organizations, swelled the ranks of the paraders. Speeches were delivered by local dignitaries, and a salute from the guns of the USS Michigan, a naval warship, boomed from the harbor. The monument is made of granite and has 4 bronze panels. They represent the infantry, artillery, cavalry, and navy, the military forces of the time of the Civil War. Building the new courthouse caused the monument to be moved. In December of 1967, it was placed in its new site on the east side of the courthouse complex. So it still does stand on the grounds of the Lake County Courthouse. And Waukegan also has the Veterans Memorial Plaza. This site stands at the former location of the American Legion building. This is a Waukegan Park District area that is part of Washington Park as well. But as you enter and walk into the Veterans Memorial Plaza, you are first greeted by Waukegan's famous drummer boy, Orion Howe. Once you make it to the back of the plaza, there you find the names of those from Waukegan who have lost their life serving in the wars dating back to the Civil War. Civil War is the first war that has Waukegan residents participate in it. So that is our story for today, the Civil War, the war efforts in Waukegan. Now, of course, there's a lot more to this story, a lot of other soldiers to talk about. I was hoping this would be about 35 minutes, but we're already going on 45 minutes. Civil War, well, I can talk about that for a long time. And, well, if you could see what my table looks like here, I have notes all over the place. Hopefully we got through it okay. Hope you enjoyed it. I will be back next week with another History Lunch and Learn. The topic, it's going to be a new one that I've created. It's called Waukegan Animal Stories. So if you have not yet watched Tiger King on Netflix, I'm giving you one more week, and then I'll share some Waukegan animal stories for you. Nothing is going to be anywhere near close to what is in that documentary, but still, we've had some interesting things happen here, animal-related wise. So that will be on April 24th at 12 p.m. The Waukegan Historical Society had planned to have a spring program on Sunday, April 26th. I was going to be presenting Ray Bradbury, Waukegan's influence on a visionary. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are canceling that program, at least for us to gather to be a part of it, but I will do it on Facebook Live. So join me on Sunday, April 26th at 2 p.m. For that Ray Bradbury program. It's part of the Historical Society's celebration of the Ray Bradbury Centennial. So, again, this was Ty Rohr, Manager of Cultural Arts for the Waukegan Park District, presenting Waukegan History Lunch and Learn of the Waukegan History Museum and the Waukegan Historical Society. Thank you again for joining me. See you again next week for another Lunch and Learn. This is Ty Rohr signing off. Have a great day.